There is a building at the end of a long, straight avenue in the centre of London that nearly every person on earth would recognise. Its grey Portland stone facade has appeared on 1 billion postcards, 1 billion news broadcasts, and 1 billion photographs taken by tourists who stand at the gates and stare through the iron railings as if they might catch a glimpse of someone royal moving behind the windows. Buckingham Palace, the official London residence of the British monarch, the administrative headquarters of the monarchy, the place where kings and queens have lived, plotted, celebrated, mourned, and in at least one case, nearly lost their minds for over 300 years. But the building you see today is a lie. Not the stones themselves, which are real enough, but what they represent, the image of permanence, of stability, of an institution that has endured unchanged for centuries. Because the truth about Buckingham Palace is that it has been plagued by disaster, dysfunction, scandal, and near destruction from the moment the first brick was laid. It is arguably the most doomed royal residence in Europe. And the story of how it became the symbol of the British monarchy is far darker than the official histories would ever admit. It begins not with a king, but with a duke. John Sheffield, 1st Duke of Buckingham, and Normanby built the original house on the site in 1703. It was called Buckingham House, and it was not a palace at all. It was a large brick townhouse, impressive by the standards of early 18th century London, but unremarkable compared to the great country estates of the English aristocracy. Sheffield chose the location for its proximity to St James's Palace, the official royal residence, and for the views across what was then open parkland, stretching south toward the Thames. Sheffield died in 1721. His illegitimate son, Charles Herbert Sheffield, inherited the house and promptly sold it to King George III in 1761 for £21,000. George did not buy it because he wanted a grand palace. He bought it because his wife, Queen Charlotte, needed a comfortable private residence away from the formality and political intrigue of St James's Palace. For the next 60 years, the building was known as the Queen's House. It was a domestic retreat, not a seat of power. The transformation from private house to national palace began with George IV, a king whose appetite for extravagance was matched only by his talent for creating financial catastrophe. In 1825, George commissioned his favourite architect, John Nash, to transform the modest Queen's House into a palace fit for the most powerful monarchy in the world. The original budget was £252,000. By the time Nash was finished, the cost had exceeded £1 million, a sum so outrageous that it triggered a parliamentary investigation, and Nash was fired before the building was completed. Nash's vision was grandiose beyond anything London had seen. He envisioned a palace that would rival Versailles, with gilded staterooms, marble columns imported from Italy, and a throne room decorated in crimson silk. The interior featured the picture gallery, a 155-foot-long corridor designed to display the royal art collection, with a glass-panelled roof that leaked from the day it was installed and continued to leak for the next 200 years. Nash used experimental construction techniques throughout the building, including hollow walls that were cheaper to build but proved impossible to insulate, meaning that the palace was freezing in winter and suffocating in summer. The problems with Nash's design were not just financial, they were structural. The palace was built around 3 sides of a courtyard, with the principal rooms facing west toward the gardens rather than east toward the mall and the public. The entrance was marked by a triumphal arch, the Marble Arch, which was placed in front of the palace but quickly deemed too narrow for the state coach to pass through. The arch was eventually moved to the northeast corner of Hyde Park, where it stands today, an orphaned monument to Nash's flawed vision. The construction process was chaotic. Nash employed over 1,000 workers, but managed them poorly. Materials were ordered and then stored in the wrong locations. Rooms were built, demolished, and rebuilt as the king changed his mind about layouts and decorations. The staterooms on the west side of the palace were decorated with elaborate French-style plasterwork and gilding that consumed gold leaf at a rate that caused the Treasury to issue formal complaints. The blue drawing room alone contained gilded columns that cost more than a London townhouse. The music room featured a domed ceiling with gilded rosettes and panels painted in trompe-l'oeil that took a team of artists over a year to complete. The throne room, designed for the investiture of honours, was finished in crimson silk that had to be imported from Lyon at enormous expense. Nash's personal finances were entangled with the project. He held property near the palace that increased in value as the building progressed, creating a conflict of interest that his critics were quick to exploit. When the Parliamentary Select Committee investigated the costs in 1831, they found evidence of invoices that had been paid twice, materials that had been ordered in excess of requirements and then sold privately, and construction work that had been charged at rates significantly above market value. Nash was not formally accused of corruption, but his reputation was destroyed, and he died in 1835, a broken man. George IV died in 1830 without ever spending a night in his new palace. His brother, William IV, inherited both the throne and the unfinished building. William hated it. He considered the palace vulgar, impractical, and far too expensive. When the Houses of Parliament burned down in 1834, William offered Buckingham Palace as a replacement, hoping to rid himself of the building entirely. Parliament declined the offer, possibly recognizing that a building so plagued by construction problems was not a suitable home for democratic government either. It fell to Queen Victoria to make Buckingham Palace the official royal residence. She moved in on July 13, 1837, 3 weeks after her accession to the throne, making her the first monarch to use the palace as a primary home. Victoria was 18 years old. She was delighted to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Kensington Palace, where she had been raised under what she called the Kensington system, a regime of isolation and control imposed by her mother and the comptroller, Sir John Conroy. But Victoria's delight was short-lived. The palace she inherited was a building that had been under construction for over a decade, passed through the hands of 2 architects, bankrupted its original budget by a factor of 4, and was still not finished. The plumbing had been installed in stages by different contractors who used incompatible systems. The kitchen was located so far from the dining rooms that food arrived cold after being carried through hundreds of feet of corridor. The servants' quarters were overcrowded and poorly ventilated, and the palace was in a deplorable state. The drains did not work properly, chimneys smoked, windows would not open, doors would not close. The ventilation system was so inadequate that some rooms were permanently filled with the smell of sewage rising from defective pipes beneath the building. Staff reported seeing rats in the kitchens, and the housekeeping arrangements were so chaotic that no single person had overall responsibility for cleaning. One account describes a situation where the Lord Steward's department was responsible for laying fires, but the Lord Chamberlain's department was responsible for lighting them, meaning that in winter, fires were often laid but never lit, because the 2 departments could not coordinate their schedules. The security at the palace was equally appalling. In December 1838, a 14-year-old boy named Edward Jones was discovered hiding in a room next to Victoria's bedroom. He had entered the palace undetected, wandered the corridors for hours, and was sitting on the throne when he was finally noticed by a servant. Jones was arrested but released without charge. He broke into the palace again in 1840 and a third time in 1841, at which point he was found hiding under a sofa in the Queen's dressing room. He was eventually sent to sea as a ship's boy to prevent further intrusions. Jones became something of a celebrity. The press nicknamed him the Boy Jones, and his repeated break-ins exposed the palace's security as farcical. The embarrassment was compounded by the fact that the palace employed hundreds of staff, none of whom could explain how a teenager had repeatedly penetrated one of the most important buildings in the country. The incident established a pattern of security failures that would continue for the next 2 centuries. In 1840, a 17-year-old named Edward Oxford fired 2 pistol shots at Victoria and Prince Albert as their carriage left the palace. Both shots missed. Oxford was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Over the course of her reign, Victoria survived a total of 8 assassination attempts, more than any other British monarch. In 1842, John Francis pointed a pistol at her carriage on Constitution Hill and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. He tried again the following day and was tackled by a plainclothes policeman. In 1849, William Hamilton fired a pistol loaded with powder, but no ball at the Queen's carriage on the same stretch of road. In 1850, Robert Pate struck Victoria across the face with his cane as she left Cambridge House, bruising her forehead and crushing her bonnet. In 1872, Arthur O'Connor pointed an unloaded pistol at her as she arrived at the palace and was tackled by John Brown, Victoria's Scottish servant, who who received a gold medal for his actions. Each attempt reinforced the vulnerability of a monarch living in a building that sat in the middle of a public park, accessible from multiple directions, surrounded by roads that anyone could use. The palace was not a fortress, it was a house with a fence, and the fence was never enough. The palace's position in central London, its inadequate perimeter security, and the regularity of the Queen's movements made her a conspicuous target. The domestic life of the palace was dominated by Victoria's relationship with Prince Albert, whom she married in February 1840. Albert threw himself into the management of the building with characteristic German thoroughness. He redesigned the household administration, installed modern drainage, and commissioned the construction of the East Wing, which enclosed the courtyard and created the facade that faces the Mall today. The East Wing was designed by Edward Blore and completed in 1847 at a cost of £150,000, funded by the sale of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Albert's improvements extended beyond plumbing and administration. He recognised that the palace needed to function as both a family home and a statement of imperial power, and he invested considerable energy in making both functions work. He supervised the hanging of paintings, chose furniture, redesigned the gardens according to principles he had studied in Germany, and personally oversaw the construction of a dairy, an ice house, and a model farm on the palace grounds. He was, in many ways, the first professional manager Buckingham Palace ever had. Every monarch since has struggled to match his combination of vision and attention to detail. The palace gardens, which cover 39 acres and include a lake, a tennis court, and a helicopter landing pad, became under Albert's direction one of the most important private gardens in London. The lake was dug in 1828 as part of Nash's original landscape design, fed by the Tyburn Brook, an underground river that still flows beneath the palace. The gardens contain over 350 species of wildflower, 30 species of breeding bird, and a mulberry tree planted by James I in 1609 in a failed attempt to establish a silk industry in England. The tree still produces fruit every summer, and mulberry jam made from its harvest is served at palace garden parties, a tradition that connects the present palace to a tree that predates the building itself by nearly a century. Albert also established the palace's role as a centre of court ceremony and state entertainment. The staterooms on the first floor of the West Wing became the setting for formal receptions, state banquets, and diplomatic events that reinforced Britain's position as the world's preeminent imperial power. The ballroom, completed in 1855 specifically for the celebration of the end of the Crimean War, was the largest room in London at 122 feet long and 60 feet wide. The room was designed by Sir James Pennethorne, a student of John Nash, and its construction involved knocking through 3 existing rooms, a process that weakened the structural integrity of the entire West Wing and required the installation of concealed iron beams that are still doing their job 170 years later. The organ at one end of the ballroom, built by Henry Willis, contains 2,818 pipes, and was the largest instrument in a private residence in Britain at the time of its installation. It was used for concerts, for church services when the chapel was unavailable, and on at least one occasion to accompany a private ballet performance commissioned by Victoria for Albert's birthday. The palace's art collection is one of the most significant in the world, though much of it is rarely seen by the public. The royal collection includes works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens, Canaletto, and Van Dyck, many of which hang in corridors and private rooms that are never included on the public tour. The Picture Gallery, Nash's 155-foot masterpiece of a room, contains over 50 major paintings, including Rembrandt's The Shipbuilder and His Wife, and Vermeer's The Music Lesson. The total value of the art within the palace has never been publicly assessed, but experts estimate it exceeds £10 billion, making Buckingham Palace one of the most valuable buildings on earth, not because of its architecture, but because of what hangs on its walls. It was designed to accommodate 1,500 guests and remains the setting for state banquets to this day. The palace staff during Victoria and Albert's time numbered over 450 people, organised into a rigid hierarchy that mirrored the class structure of Victorian society. The Lord Steward managed the kitchens and domestic staff. The Lord Chamberlain managed the staterooms and ceremonial staff. The Master of the Horse managed the royal stables and transport. Below them, a descending pyramid of housekeepers, footmen, maids, cooks, gardeners, coachmen, and pages maintained the building around the clock. The most junior members of staff earned as little as £12 per year and were expected to be invisible. A footman who was seen by a member of the royal family in a corridor at an unexpected time could be dismissed immediately. The kitchen operation alone was extraordinary. State banquets required food for up to 170 guests, served on gold plates from a collection that includes over 4,000 individual pieces of gilded silver and gold tableware. Each place setting at a state banquet uses 6 glasses, 3 knives, 3 forks, and 3 spoons, all laid with mathematical precision using a ruler. The preparation begins 5 days before the dinner. The table is measured and set 2 days in advance. Fresh flowers are arranged the morning of the event. The entire operation involves over 100 staff working in shifts, but the palace that Albert worked so hard to improve became his tomb. Albert died on December 14, 1861, at Windsor Castle, probably from typhoid fever, though some historians have suggested Crohn's disease or abdominal cancer. He was 42 years old. Victoria was devastated beyond any conventional expression of grief. She withdrew from public life almost entirely, refusing to appear at state occasions, wearing black for the remaining 40 years of her life, and maintaining Albert's rooms at the palace exactly as he had left them. His clothes were laid out each evening. Hot water was brought to his dressing room every morning. His chamber pot was cleaned daily. The palace became a shrine to a dead prince, maintained by a queen who could not accept that he was gone. Victoria's withdrawal created a political crisis. The palace stood largely empty for years. The public began to question why they were funding a building that the monarch refused to use. Republican sentiment grew. Posters appeared on the palace railings, reading, "These commanding premises to be let or sold," in consequence of the late occupants' declining business. The monarchy's popularity reached its lowest point in the 19th century, and the palace, standing dark and abandoned in the heart of London, became the visible symbol of a crown that appeared to have lost its purpose. The palace's physical decline during Victoria's withdrawal was severe. Without the Queen in residence to justify expenditure, maintenance was neglected. The roof leaked. Plaster fell from ceilings. The gardens, which Albert had meticulously maintained, became overgrown. When Victoria eventually died on January the 22nd, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the palace she had abandoned was in worse condition than it had been when she first moved in 64 years earlier. Edward VII restored the palace to active use after his accession in 1901, redecorating extensively and hosting lavish entertainments that earned him the nickname Edward the Caresser. He stripped out Victoria's memorial rooms, replaced the dark Victorian furnishings with lighter Edwardian decor, and re-established the palace as the social centre of the British establishment. Edward's reign was brief but transformative. He died in 1910, and the palace he left behind was a far more functional and welcoming building than the one he had inherited. But his improvements were largely cosmetic. The fundamental structural problems that Nash had built into the palace 80 years earlier remained unaddressed. The walls were still hollow, the plumbing was still Victorian, the electrical system, hastily installed in the 1880s, was already dangerously outdated. The palace was beautiful on the surface and disintegrating beneath it. George V and Queen Mary further modernized the building during their reign from 1910 to 1936. In 1913, the east facade was refaced in Portland stone by Sir Aston Webb, creating the familiar grey front that faces the Mall today. The original Bloor facade had been constructed from soft Caen stone that was already crumbling after less than 70 years. The refacing was completed in just 13 weeks, an extraordinary feat of construction that required the existing stone to be removed and replaced while the interior of the building remained in use. The refacing was necessary not just for aesthetic reasons, but because the original stone was literally falling off the building. Chunks of Caen stone had been dropping from the facade onto the forecourt, creating a genuine danger to the guards and to the public who gathered at the gates. The new Portland stone facade was thicker, harder, and designed to withstand the corrosive effects of London's coal smoke. which had been eating away at the building since the Industrial Revolution. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The most visible symbol of British permanence required its face replaced after less than 7 decades, because the original materials were not strong enough to survive the environment that British industry had created. George V's reign also saw the installation of the famous palace balcony, which became the monarchy's primary point of direct contact with the British public. The balcony had existed since Bloor's East Wing was completed in 1847, but it was George V who established the tradition of the royal family appearing there during moments of national significance. His appearance on the balcony on Armistice Day, November 11, 1918, before a crowd estimated at over 100,000, established a ritual that would be repeated after every coronation, royal wedding, and jubilee for the next century. The palace during the interwar years became the setting for increasingly elaborate garden parties, which George V and Queen Mary used as tools of soft diplomacy and social management. Each summer, 3 garden parties were held on the palace lawn, hosting approximately 8,000 guests each. The invitation list was carefully curated to include representatives from every level of British society, from aristocrats and politicians to teachers, nurses, and factory workers. The message was deliberate. The monarchy belonged to everyone. The palace gates, usually closed, were opened wide. Tea and cake were served on the lawn, and for one afternoon, ordinary people walked the same ground as the royal family. The abdication crisis of 1936 brought the palace its most dramatic political scandal. Edward VIII, who had been king for less than a year, informed Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin that he intended to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The constitutional implications were severe. The monarch was the head of the Church of England, which at the time did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons. Baldwin told Edward that the marriage was unacceptable. Edward chose to abdicate rather than give up Simpson. The abdication was announced on December 11, 1936. Edward broadcast his decision to the nation from Windsor Castle, speaking the famous words, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." He left England the following day and spent the rest of his life in exile, mostly in France. The abdication left deep scars on the royal family that took decades to heal. George VI never fully forgave his brother for abandoning the throne and leaving him to bear a burden he had never wanted. The Queen Mother, who blamed the stress of kingship for her husband's declining health and premature death in 1952 at the age of 56, reportedly refused to speak to the Duchess of Windsor for the rest of her life. The palace itself bore witness to the human cost of the abdication. The rooms that Edward had occupied were stripped of his personal belongings and redecorated within weeks. Photographs were removed. His name was spoken less and less in official contexts. The institution that operated from within these walls had a remarkable capacity for erasure. People who fell from favour did not merely leave, they were systematically written out of the narrative. Their presence in the building acknowledged only in the archives that most people would never see. The palace became the setting for a different kind of royal story under George VI and his family. The palace he had occupied for less than 12 months passed to his brother, who became George VI and moved into Buckingham Palace with visible reluctance and considerable anxiety about his fitness for the role. George VI and Queen Elizabeth moved into Buckingham Palace in February 1937 with their 2 daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. The new king was painfully shy, suffered from a severe stammer that made public speaking an ordeal, and had never expected or wanted to be king. The palace, which should have been a source of comfort and stability, instead magnified his anxieties. The building was too large, too public, and too demanding. Every meal was a formal occasion. Every corridor contained staff who expected instructions. Every room reminded him that he occupied a position he had never been prepared for. His wife, Queen Elizabeth, adapted more readily. She understood instinctively that the palace was a stage, and that the royal family's survival depended on performing their roles convincingly. She redecorated the private apartments to create a sense of domestic normalcy, established routines for the princesses that balanced royal obligation with something approaching a normal childhood, and presented to the public an image of family harmony that concealed the considerable strain behind the walls. George VI's reign brought the palace its most physically destructive period. During the Blitz, London was bombed repeatedly by the Luftwaffe between September 1940 and May 1941. Buckingham Palace was hit by German bombs on 16 separate occasions. The most serious attack occurred on September 13, 1940, when a German bomber flew directly along the Mall and dropped 6 bombs on the palace in broad daylight. 2 bombs exploded in the quadrangle, destroying the royal chapel. The king and queen were in the building at the time. The blast shattered windows throughout the palace and sent debris crashing through corridors where staff were working. A lesser-known bomb struck the palace swimming pool, which had been built for George VI in 1938 at a cost of £2,000. The pool was destroyed and never rebuilt during the war. Another bomb hit the North Lodge, killing a police constable named Steve Robertson, who was the only person killed by enemy action inside the palace grounds. His death is commemorated by a small plaque near the entrance, which most visitors walk past without noticing. The palace cellars were converted into air raid shelters, reinforced with steel girders and stocked with supplies. The princesses Elizabeth and Margaret were evacuated to Windsor Castle, but the king and queen remained at the palace throughout the Blitz, sleeping in the reinforced basement on nights when the bombing was particularly heavy. They kept a supply of weapons in their private apartments. The queen reportedly learned to shoot with a pistol in the palace gardens, telling an aide that she refused to go down like the other monarchs in Europe without firing a shot. Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, famously said, "I am glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The East End of London had been suffering devastating bombing for weeks, and there had been public resentment that the royal family appeared to be sheltered from the destruction. The bombing of the palace, paradoxically, strengthened the monarchy's connection with the British public. The king and queen made a deliberate decision to remain in London throughout the Blitz, visiting bombed neighbourhoods and appearing alongside civil defence workers. Their presence at the palace during the bombing became one of the defining images of British wartime resolve. The palace during the war years functioned as a military headquarters as much as a royal residence. The basement housed a war room where the king received daily intelligence briefing. The staterooms were shrouded in dust sheets and their chandeliers dismantled to prevent them from becoming lethal projectiles during bombing raids. The staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. Rationing was observed strictly, with the king and queen eating the same rations as their subjects. The palace kitchens, which in peacetime could produce a 170-course state banquet, served simple meals of meat, vegetables, and bread. The message was clear. The monarchy was sharing the sacrifice. The VE Day celebrations on May 8, 1945, brought the palace its most joyful moment since the coronation of George V in 1911. Over 1 million people crowded the Mall and the streets around the palace, chanting, "We want the king," until the royal family appeared on the balcony. They appeared 8 times that day. On the final appearance, after darkness had fallen, the princesses Elizabeth and Margaret were allowed to slip out of the palace and join the crowds anonymously. Elizabeth, who was 19 and serving in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, later described it as one of the most memorable nights of her life. She and Margaret linked arms with strangers and danced through the streets of London, unrecognised, celebrating the end of a war that had threatened to destroy everything the palace represented. The palace also played host to one of the most audacious security breaches in modern British history. On July 9, 1982, a 31-year-old unemployed man named Michael Fagan climbed a drainpipe, entered the palace through an unlocked window, and wandered the corridors for approximately 15 minutes before finding his way into the Queen's bedroom. Elizabeth II woke to find a stranger sitting on the edge of her bed, holding a broken glass ashtray. According to Fagan's later accounts, They had a brief conversation. The Queen pressed a panic button twice, but no one came. She called the palace switchboard, but no response. She eventually persuaded Fagin to follow her to a pantry, where a footman appeared and detained him until police arrived. The Fagin incident exposed security failures so comprehensive that they were almost impossible to believe. The alarm system in the Queen's corridor had been switched off months earlier because it kept giving false alerts. The police officer who should have been guarding the corridor was walking the corgis. The night patrol schedule had gaps that left entire wings of the palace unmonitored. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner offered his resignation, though it was declined. Fagin was charged with trespassing, but acquitted because at the time, trespassing in a royal palace was not a criminal offence in England. The law was subsequently changed. The incident highlighted a problem that had plagued the palace since the Boy Jones broke in during Victoria's reign. The building was simply too large and too complex to secure effectively, with 775 rooms, 78 bathrooms, 52 bedrooms, 19 staterooms, and over 800 members of staff moving through the building at any given time. The palace functioned less like a secure residence and more like a small town with inadequate policing. The post-war years brought a different kind of crisis to the palace. The building was in desperate need of repair after years of wartime neglect and bomb damage. The heating system was antiquated. The electrical wiring was dangerous. The plumbing leaked. Asbestos lined many of the rooms and corridors. A comprehensive survey conducted in the 1990s identified structural problems so severe that the palace was described by one engineer as a building held together by its paint. The fire at Windsor Castle on November 20th, 1992, which destroyed or damaged 115 rooms, raised urgent questions about the maintenance of royal building. Queen Elizabeth II described 1992 as her annus horribilis, a year that also saw the separation of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, the divorce of Princess Anne, and the publication of Andrew Morton's biography of Diana, which revealed the depth of dysfunction within the royal family. Elizabeth II's relationship with Buckingham Palace spanned 7 decades and was defined by duty rather than affection. She reportedly preferred Windsor Castle for its relative privacy and its proximity to the countryside she loved, but she understood that the palace was the monarchy's public face, and she maintained it with the same quiet discipline she applied to every other aspect of her role. She hosted 112 state banquets, held over 50 investiture ceremonies per year, and appeared on the palace balcony for Trooping the Colour every June for 70 years. The balcony appearances became iconic moments in national life, from her coronation in 1953 to the celebrations for her diamond and platinum jubilees. The palace also witnessed some of Elizabeth's most difficult personal moments. It was from the palace that she broadcast her Christmas messages, including the anguished address in 1992, when she acknowledged her annus horribilis. It was to the palace that she returned after the death of her mother and sister within weeks of each other in 2002. And it was at the palace that she sat alone during Prince Philip's funeral in April 2021, masked and isolated due to COVID restrictions, in an image that captured both the loneliness of monarchy and the inhumanity of a pandemic that spared no one. The palace became the focal point of public grief after Diana's death on August 31st, 1997. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered at the palace gates, leaving flowers, candles, and messages that eventually covered the ground for hundreds of yards along the mall. The absence of a flag at half-mast over the palace became a source of intense public anger. Royal protocol dictated that the only flag flown over Buckingham Palace was the royal standard, and it was only flown when the sovereign was in residence. The Queen was at Balmoral. There was no flag to lower. The public did not care about protocol. They wanted a visible sign of mourning from the institution that Diana had married into, been rejected by, and ultimately escaped from. The silence from the palace was interpreted as cold indifference. Tony Blair's government pressured the Queen to return to London. She did, eventually, and a Union Jack was flown at half-mast for the first time in the palace's history. The episode revealed the gap between the monarchy's ceremonial traditions and the emotional expectations of a modern public. The palace, once again, was the stage on which the monarchy's relevance was questioned. Diana's funeral on September 6, 1997, saw her coffin pass along the mall in front of the palace, followed on foot by Prince Charles, Prince Philip, Prince William, Prince Harry, and Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. William was 15, Harry was 12. The image of two boys walking behind their mother's coffin past the building that had been both her home and, in many ways, her prison became one of the most powerful and disturbing images in the history of the British monarchy. The palace loomed in the background of every photograph, every news broadcast, every front page. It was, as it had always been, the silent witness. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw the palace attempt to modernize its public image. The first official palace website launched in 1997. The staterooms were open to summer visitors in 1993, initially to fund the repair of Windsor Castle after the fire. The Queen's Gallery, a purpose-built exhibition space attached to the palace, opened in 2002, displaying rotating selections from the Royal Collection, which includes over 7,000 paintings, 500,000 prints, and 30,000 drawings, accumulated by British monarchs over 5 centuries. But modernisation could not protect the monarchy from the scandals that increasingly defined its public perception. The palace's role in the royal family's public image became increasingly complicated in the 21st century. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein, which became public in 2019, generated intense scrutiny of the palace's crisis management capabilities. Andrew's disastrous BBC interview in November 2019, in which he denied meeting Virginia Giuffre despite photographic evidence, was widely regarded as the worst royal PR performance in modern history. He was stripped of his royal duties and military titles in January 2022 and settled Giuffre's civil lawsuit for an undisclosed sum. His continued residence in Royal Lodge, a crown property near Windsor, became a source of ongoing public controversy. The palace's internal culture also came under scrutiny. Reports of bullying complaints against senior members of the royal family surfaced in multiple newspapers. Staff turnover in key positions was reported to be unusually high. Former employees described an environment of intense pressure, rigid hierarchy, and limited personal autonomy. The palace was, according to these accounts, a difficult place to work, not because the physical conditions were poor, but because the institutional culture demanded absolute discretion, total loyalty, and the suppression of personal opinions on any matter related to the royal family. The departure of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in January 2020 and their subsequent interview with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021, in which they made allegations of racism and neglect within the institution, generated a crisis that played out on the global stage. The palace's response, a brief statement reading Recollections May Vary, was criticised as inadequate by commentators on both sides of the debate. The episode reinforced the perception that the palace operated according to rules and protocols that were increasingly disconnected from the expectations of modern society. A 10-year renovation programme began in 2017 with an estimated cost of £369 million. The work involves replacing every electrical cable, every pipe, every boiler, and every piece of outdated infrastructure in the building, while the palace remains in use and open to visitors. The project is the most extensive renovation since the palace was built, and it has revealed the full extent of the building's decay. Workers have found Victorian drainage pipes that were never connected to the main sewer system, meaning that for over a century, sewage had been draining into the soil beneath the palace rather than into London's sewer network. They found gas pipes that were still live despite having been officially decommissioned in the 1950s. They found rooms that did not appear on any floor plan, sealed behind false walls during previous renovations, and forgotten. They found a cache of World War II era documents in a sealed basement corridor that had not been opened since 1945. Workers have also discovered that the palace foundations, originally designed for a modest townhouse, have been carrying the weight of a building 4 times larger than the structure they were intended to support. The east wing, added by Bloor in 1847, sits on foundations that were never properly integrated with Nash's original structure, creating stress fractures that have been widening for over 170 years. Engineers have installed monitoring systems to track the movement of the walls in real time. The building is, in the most literal sense, pulling itself apart. Electrical wiring from the 1940s running through asbestos-lined cavities. Lead paint on surfaces in rooms used daily by staff. The palace, behind its immaculate Portland stone facade, was rotting from within. This is the paradox of Buckingham Palace. From the outside, it represents permanence, tradition, and the unbroken continuity of the British state. From the inside, it has always been a building in crisis. Too expensive, too poorly built, too politically controversial, too large for comfort, and too small for ceremony. A house that was never meant to be a palace, forced into a role it was never designed to fill, occupied by monarchs who in many cases would rather have lived somewhere else. The palace today contains 775 rooms, including 19 staterooms, 52 royal and guest bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms, 92 offices, and 78 bathrooms. It has its own post office, cinema, swimming pool, doctor's surgery, and chapel. The household employs approximately 800 people full-time, and thousands more on a casual basis for events and ceremony. The annual cost of maintaining the palace and the broader royal household is funded by the sovereign grant, which in 2023 amounted to £86.3 million, equivalent to approximately £1.29 per person in the United Kingdom. The staterooms are open to visitors each summer when the monarch is at Balmoral, generating approximately £40 million in ticket revenue that goes toward the building's maintenance. Visitors pass through the grand staircase, the throne room, the picture gallery, and the ballroom before exiting through the gardens. They see approximately 1% of the building. The remaining 99%, the offices, the service corridors, the kitchens, the staff quarters, and the private apartments, remains invisible. Like the monarchy itself, the palace shows the public only what it wants the public to see. Queen Victoria hated it. Edward VII used it as a party venue. George V endured it. Edward VIII abandoned it. George VI was bombed in it. Elizabeth II spent 70 years maintaining it while it crumbled around her. And Charles III inherited a building that requires nearly £400 million of renovation just to prevent it from falling down. The most doomed palace in Britain is not a ruin on a Scottish hillside or a demolished manor in the English countryside. It is the building at the end of the mall that 3 million tourists photograph every year, believing they are looking at the permanent, unshakable heart of the British monarchy. They are looking at a building that has been failing since the day it was built. And the monarchy it represents has survived not because of Buckingham Palace, but in spite of it. The facade holds. It always holds. That is what facades are for.